Greetings and various assorted salutations. Today we're looking at the basics of the Vietnam War. This is kind of an introduction to kind of get an idea of when is this conflict, why is this a conflict, what's going on, and kind of slot it into our larger unit. So, to get things rolling. Now, the Vietnam War is actually just one of several conflicts in the Cold War. Throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout the Middle East, there are numerous indirect conflicts between the superpowers of the United States and the USSR. These indirect conflicts would often amount to one side would support the communists, the USSR, and the US would take sides with the whoever was willing to oppose communism. And while these were indirect struggles for places like the United States and the USSR, occasionally the USSR and the United States would fight directly in those countries, in cases such as Korea, Afghanistan, and Vietnam, as we'll learn about today. But essentially, for the locals of these different areas, these were direct conflicts. In Korea, north and south, mostly Koreans, civilians and soldiers, died in the fighting. And the same goes for Afghanistan when the Soviets would invade that in the 1980s. Vietnam is particularly important as a turning point in American culture and American society as we're moving forward. First, the driving question is, why Vietnam? This Southeast Asian country in the map up here is a former colony, a former colonial holding of the French Empire, and like many nations in Africa, it shook off its European ruler after World War II. And really, at first, the United States had a minor interest in this locale. President Kennedy would kind of step things up by sending more U.S. Special Forces to train the Vietnam nationalists, the South Vietnamese, to fight the communists in Vietnam. This was fairly normal procedure. The Soviets would send in people to train communist revolutionaries. The U.S. would train anti-communist revolutionaries. The Soviets would use their Spetsnaz, which I probably mispronounced. The U.S. would use their special forces. And a proxy war would ensue. That's usually what happens in most of these conflicts. Each locals with their own vision of the future would find themselves appealing to either the U.S. or the Soviets for resources, such as weapons and training, to violently carve out their new nation. What really puts the United States, America, on edge with this is the concept of the Domino Theory. Essentially, there'll be an activity in the unit that goes into more detail, but basically the idea is that if one nation falls to communism, the resources of that nation will be used to knock over another nation into communism, and another, and another, and another. Basically, places like Korea, Vietnam, China's already fallen, and those places fall in Asia to communism, it would threaten American allies such as the Philippines, Japan, and Australia. And so advisors to the president felt that preventing Vietnam from going whole commie would require more troops and resources. And so starting under the Kennedy administration particularly, more and more resources would be sent to South Vietnam. Now, the thing that really changes the tune of Vietnam from a special forces advisory role to an open Vietnam War scenario, as we think of it, is the Gulf of Tonkin. Basically, chaos is going to ensue. There's a coup in Vietnam, and then unrelated but very problematic, President John F. Kennedy is assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson is thrust in as president, and he's kind of put into a position where he decides to increase U.S. involvement. In the Gulf of Tonkin, according to the reports, North Vietnam torpedoed 2 U.S. destroyers. Later accounts point out that that didn't really happen, but that's a topic for another day. The point is what comes out of this is a document called the Gulf of Tonkin. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I do apologize. Basically, this document is very important, and it gives the President of the United States special powers to address the Vietnam issue as he sees fit. And so, as a result, the United States will begin sending in more and more troops to formally fight the North Vietnamese and the communist resistant group, the Viet Cong. Some of these operations are going to be a mixture of things. But let's roll into it. But basically, on the public end of things, we have operations like Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a bombing campaign to crush North Vietnam, and U.S. troop deployments of regular U.S. troops, and eventually a draft would kick in as well to provide more troops to fight in Vietnam. But also there were some CIA covert operations. We had the CIA launching attacks against the communist revolutionaries in bordering neutral countries like Laos, where the Viet Cong would use these neutral territories as a way of moving supplies and personnel freely off the official battlefield. But it gets worse. The fighting in Vietnam isn't conventional warfare with formal enemies dressed up following the Geneva Convention. The Viet Cong often did not wear uniforms, and they would hide amongst the civilian population throughout Vietnam. And they would blend in very easily, as American troops would have a very hard difference figuring out who's who. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Cong and Northern Communists, he typically refused to fight the U.S. head-on because, one, he wasn't going to win that way. It was a very dumb idea. The U.S. was ready for World War III. You come out guns blazing, the U.S. will counter with more guns blazing. But the United States was not ready for guerrilla warfare, with people poking in and out of jungles and launching hit-and-run tactics, traps, and other covert tactics. Ho Chi Minh felt that the Viet Cong needed to fight like tigers against an elephant. That's kind of the analogy he used. An elephant can really easily kill a tiger if it's out in the open. However, the Viet Cong would fight more like a tiger, striking from the trees and disappearing into the woods, and the idea was to bleed out the elephant, per se, is the analogy they went for. Now, the U.S. would try and counter these attacks. The U.S. would use weapons like napalm and white phosphorus to burn down entire sections of the Vietnam jungle, with herbicide chemicals like Agent Orange that was also used. The U.S. idea was very simple. You can't hide in a jungle that's on fire or completely wiped off the face of the earth. The United States even toyed with, for a while, thinking about using nuclear weapons to clear out the jungles. This project was abandoned, thankfully, due to the concern of escalating the war out of a regional war and making it into World War III. But that's not to say that the methods that the U.S. did use to clear out the jungles were not that great. Agent Orange is this nasty plant-killing chemical that also causes things like birth defects, diabetes, and a whole host of nasty diseases that many American troops were exposed to, many Vietnamese were exposed to. Nasty stuff. And it's passed on to the children of those people as well. White phosphorus is banned by international treaties that the U.S. never signed. Basically, it's a chemical that burns things like air and skin, and it really only stops burning when it runs out of stuff to burn. It's nasty stuff that you do not want to be exposed to. The U.S. would also use a tactic called search and destroy. This is where U.S. troops would find Viet Cong troops, draw them out, and then hammer them with everything they had, overwhelming firepower, air support, and artillery to, well, try and destroy them. But military-wise, the United States is going to slog through this war with a number of successes, actually. While many U.S. troops are going to suffer considerably from PTSD-inducing nightmarish ambushes, the Viet Cong could not easily seize cities or industrial areas needed to form, well, any sort of nation. It's hard to pin down the exact casualties, but the Viet Cong suffered dearly during this long war of attrition. America's costs were high, but nothing compared to the Vietnam communists or the people of Vietnam, who it was fighting in their yard. It is worth considering that when that there was fighting in Vietnam before America, there was fighting during the American-Vietnam War, and violence would continue after the war, and did not end for quite some time. In class, what we're going to look at is politically, the United States people are going to lose interest in this conflict in increasing numbers. Many Americans were very put off by the brutal tactics needed to ensure freedom in some corner of the world that many Americans, quite frankly, probably couldn't place on a map. Though initially it seemed like just one of the many conflicts of the Cold War, many Americans would come to question, especially after the Tet Offensive and after Americans began learning more and more about the war through secure information leaks and TV, that the American government is not always what they say they are, or say they're doing. But we're going to cover those things and things like the Tet Offensive more in class. But no. And then after this unit, we're going to transition into kind of the cultural and societal shifts of the 60s and 70s that led to a less socially stable one than the previous era, the 1950s. But the Vietnam War has a lasting legacy on the American people in ways that many of us don't always fully necessarily realize. But that's for the unit ahead. That's for the unit we're in. Until later.